this morning, I figured it was appropriate for Palm Sunday. It's the last Sunday I'm teaching. I think Shane's coming up after me. But for Palm Sunday, I figured it'd be appropriate. I am sure that many of you have heard a lot of objections to Easter. And so I wanted to take a break from our workbook. And I'm going to give you a defense of Easter. But before we get started on this, like always, we're going to have our 5 questions. Just as a reminder, no Bible, no phone to answer the questions. All right. So question number 1, why is the Sunday before the resurrection called Palm Sunday?
It's when Jesus was riding on a donkey, they laid palm branches down for him.
Okay, yeah, that's close enough. All right, question number 2. How many hours was Jesus on the cross?
6.
6. Very good. Question number 3. How many times did Peter deny Christ? 3. Okay, question number 4. What happened in the temple as a sign that the death of Jesus made a way for the people to approach God? That question is kind of a mouthful, so let me ask it again. What happened in the temple? What's that?
Go ahead. No.
What happened in the temple as a sign that the death of Jesus made a way for people to approach God?
Curtain was torn.
Curtain was torn. Huh?
But what way?
Okay, I mean,
The way is really cool.
curtain was torn, yes.
I don't remember.
But it was torn in a way that it couldn't have been done by a person.
What was it then?
I don't remember. I knew it was, you can't do it by a person.
Top to bottom.
I remember that
showed
part.
how to
Yeah.
get God.
But
That's right.
If it was a person, they would have gone
It
to the
was really
bottom.
tall.
Yeah, but
There you go.
that's why I thought it was so cool, because it's top to bottom, like you said, it couldn't have been done by anybody.
Yes, it was torn from top to bottom, which is impossible, unless it was God who did it. So question number 5. As a reminder, 5 guesses as a group. Cannot look in your Bible, cannot look in your phone. So who was compelled to carry Jesus' cross? Who was compelled to help Jesus carry his cross?
Simon of Cyrene.
Yep. That's it. Thought that would have been going a little bit longer than the first guess. That's okay.
Should have waited, but
What's that?
I said I guess have waited a little bit.
You got it.
All right, yeah, so this morning I am doing a defense of Easter. We're supposed to be in chapter 18 of Matthew this morning, but I wanted to take a break from that, and Shane can figure it out. Try and make up. But we're going to do a defense of Easter this morning. For the past few weeks, we've been walking through Matthew, and I've been showing y'all that how Christ is the fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures, how Jesus is the new and better Moses, how he is the new and second Adam. But today, we're going to be looking at something else. We're going to be taking a break from the lesson plan that we've been working out of, and we will be discussing one of the most important, if not the most important, Christian holiday on our calendar. I have stressed to y'all in the past that it's important to have a well-reasoned, a well-rounded, strong defense for what it is that we believe. But today, I'm going to give you an example of what it means to defend your belief. I'm sure you've heard it said that Easter has its origins of paganism. It's all over Facebook, TikTok, X, and YouTube, and I'm sure many other social media websites I don't know anything about. I'm getting a little bit too old nowadays. I don't know. I can't keep up anymore. But anyway, people claiming that the Easter celebration was co-opted from pagan goddesses like Ishtar and Ezekiel. and that the Easter bunny and the eggs are symbols of fertility and new life and the rebirth of the earth, and that because of these things, Christians are unknowingly worshiping false gods, and that we should stop doing so, and that we should go back to celebrating Passover instead, or maybe that we should come up with a new celebration with no ties to paganism. And today I will be demonstrating to you how Easter is not now, nor has it ever been pagan. No part of Easter has any connections to paganism, and how it's always been Christian. I mean, well, really, it started out as Jewish, but then it became Christian. But my point still remains. Some of y'all were here last year when I gave this same lesson, but it's not exactly the same. I updated it a little bit. But here are the potential issues that you will hear a lot of people give. The issues they typically bring up, the objections they usually have, is that the timing of when Easter started coincides with pagan religions. They say that the name for Easter comes from paganism, namely that it comes from, that the name Easter is from the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, and the Venerable Bede admitted that it comes from the goddess named Eostra. They'll say that our symbols for Easter come from paganism, that the Easter bunny is a pagan fertility idol, and that the Easter egg is a relic of the egg of Astarte. Astarte. I'm not sure how to pronounce that word, but that's okay. They'll say that Lent is 40 days of weeping for Tammuz. And they'll ask us, why don't we just call it Passover instead? And then they will also claim that Easter is a replacement for the biblical Passover. They'll tell us that if we love Jesus, that you will keep his commands, right? And that God gave us, good morning, and that God gave us the feast as feast to last forever. And that if we truly love Jesus, that we would do those things. And they'll say that Jesus said that he would be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. And so Friday afternoon to Sunday morning doesn't work. So before we continue with explaining the answers to these objections, let's start by pointing out the obvious. What is the purpose of Easter? What is Easter?
Celebrating Christ's risen.
Yes, exactly. It's a feast that commemorates Christ's death and resurrection, and it's observed on the first Sunday after the Paschal full moon. It is the day in which we remember and celebrate what Christ has done for us by taking our place on the cross and making propitiation for the wrath of God against our sins. So now we're going to focus on the first objection here. And does the timing of when Easter started coincide with pagan feasts? And to answer this question, I think that two things need to be answered. Two things need to be discussed. And that is the earliest celebrations for what we call Easter and the origins of the name itself. And so we'll start with the timing. So does the timing coincide with pagan religions? And what I mean by this is, does the Easter celebration seem to be co-opted from pagan religions and their feasts? So obviously everything coincides with the pagan ritual or pagan feast or pagan holiday, because they've always been. So what I mean by that is, does it seem to be co-opted? So as Christianity is going into one nation or into one culture, does it seem as though their religion kind of just morphs into Christianity? That their feasts or holidays seem to be morphed into Christian feasts and holidays. So first, let me ask you, when do you think the celebration of Easter started? If you had to take a guess, when do you think Christians started celebrating Easter?
Somewhere around the Reformation.
Okay. So around the 1500s-ish, 1600s, some in that time frame. All right. Anybody else have any ideas? And if you know the answer, feel free to say it too. Okay. So our only guess is 1500s. All right. So its origins, believe it or not, it's with the Passover itself, with the believing Jews. So right there in the first century, the early Christians started celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. They just didn't call it Easter at the time. In the beginning, the believing Jews simply celebrated the resurrection of Jesus during Passover. And when the Gentiles came into the fold, they wanted to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, but they wanted to do it on the day that Jesus actually arose from the dead. And so that'd be on Sunday. And so right there in the second century, you had the church was pretty split on this issue. You had some of them wanted to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus during Passover, and the others, mainly the Gentile believers, wanted to observe the resurrection on the first Sunday after Passover. And so these Christians felt that celebrating Christ's death and resurrection on the day that he actually resurrected, to them it just made more sense. And in the beginning, these Gentiles actually still called it Passover, believe it or not. And they just did it a little bit differently. They didn't feel the need to continue the same exact observance that the Jews did. Instead of doing the actual Passover meal, they decided to take elements of the Passover Seder and elements from the change that Jesus made to the Passover Seder during the Last Supper with his disciples, and they made a new feast. At that time, they simply just called it the Last Supper feast. And they did it on what we now call Good Friday. And then 2 days later on Sunday is when they would have their second feast. Now, I'm not sure exactly what they called that second feast, but the weekend celebration itself they called Passover. And over time, that meal became the Easter meal that we know today. Which obviously the Easter meal isn't this, set thing that every family does. Every family kind of has their own Easter traditions. But over time, the what they called the Passover meal at that time, which was the weekend celebration, we now call Easter. I actually meant to talk about this during the lesson itself, but I forgot to put it in there, so I'm going to say it now. Oftentimes, people will look at the Council of Nicaea, and they will say that Constantine is this big boogeyman of the Christian faith, that he co-opted so many things from paganism and so on and so forth. A big claim, too, is that Constantine hated the Jews. And so, therefore, they did everything that they could to try and separate themselves from the Jewish faith and from the Jewish practices. Now, it's not entirely untruthful that Constantine did not particularly like the Jews, and maybe he did hate the Jews. But the reason why Christians, by and large, started celebrating Passover on the first Sunday after the Paschal full moon, the reason why they started doing that is for two reasons. For one, as I already mentioned, it's because they wanted to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on the day of the week it actually happened, and that was Sunday. And two, one of the things that happened during this council is that there was a discussion that went on. So as I already mentioned in this lesson, the early Christians were very split on the issue of when to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. Do they do it during the Passover meal, or do they do it on the Sunday? And a lot of the Jews were doing it during the Passover meal, and a lot of the Gentiles were doing it on the Passover Sunday, the Sunday after Passover. And so the big issue was, during this council, is they wanted to reconcile this. They wanted to figure out, first of all, should anything be done about this to try and get everybody on the same page, or should we just let things go as they are? And the decision that was come to which Constantine had nothing to do with, by the way. The decision that was come to was that should they celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on the Passover meal as a group collectively, or should they celebrate it on Sunday? And in this council, they actually did not come to a conclusion as to which one it should be, just that simply the church should come together and celebrate it together on the same day. Now, it was Constantine's opinion that the church should adopt the Sunday method, the one that we use today. And, I am sure that his opinion on the matter carried a lot of weight. But the decision was that we should all celebrate it on the same day, not that we should celebrate it on that Sunday. It's just the simple fact of the matter is that the majority of Christians were celebrating it on the Sunday anyway. It made more sense. And I agree with the verdict. I think that it makes more sense for Christians to celebrate it together on the same day. And I think it makes more sense to do it on the Sunday after the Paschal full moon. I think it makes perfect sense. So anyway, I wanted to add this into the lesson because I forgot to say it, and it needed to be said. All right, now back to the lesson.
So what exactly are the origins of the name Easter then? So was Easter in its name at least? We know the timing isn't co-opted from pagan religions. It actually comes straight out of Judaism. So in the name, was Easter co-opted from pagan religions, co-opted from pagan goddesses? Well, to discuss this, we need to first talk about how the word Easter came about. So Easter, obviously, is an English word. And as we have already discussed, the Easter celebration didn't start out with that name. It wasn't until Christianity spread into Northern Europe that the celebration took on that name. So before then, the name of the feast was still called Pascha, or some variation of it. So Pascha being a variation of Passover itself. So in Greek, it's still to this day, by the way. It's not just back then. Still to this day, every other language still calls it Passover. Just whatever the variation of that is in their language. So in Greek, it's Pascha. In Greek, it's Pesach. My bad. In Spanish, it's Pascha. In Welsh, it's Pasch. In Romanian, it spells exactly the word paste. I don't know, it's probably not how you pronounce it, but that's how it looks to me, paste. Anyway, and all of these, and so many more, are variations of Pascha, or Pesach, which is the word Passover in Hebrew. And just so you understand, Easter is an English translation, or transliteration rather, of a Germanic word that means resurrection, or the dawn. And this word itself is getting at the heart of what the Christian Pesach celebration is all about. It's all about the resurrection of Jesus. So by this time, the Christians had been calling Sunday Resurrection Sunday, or Resurrection Day. And the celebration of the Christian Passover had grown to be an entire week at this point. So they started with Palm Sunday, and this is the Sunday before Easter. This is today. And this was to commemorate when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, and the people were wanting him to be king. They wanted to set him up as Messiah, as the king. And then on Friday, they would have the Last Supper feast, the Last Supper meal. And this was to commemorate the death of Christ. This feast would be the one that looks most like the Passover Seder. Then on Sunday, they had Resurrection Day. And this was to commemorate the day that Jesus arose from the dead. So if you're following me here, then you understand the change in the name from Passover to Easter was simply a natural shift in language. The language of Resurrection Day had already been established long before the name was changed to Easter. The only real change that there was just the name of the entire week. The entire week-long celebration changed from the name being Passover to simply just being Easter. So the celebration, the name of the celebration was changed to simply the big event that takes place right at the end. And if you think about it, Passover is the main event of that feast as well. So to be clear of what I mean, when it comes to the Passover feast, the main event of that feast was the Passover event itself, right? And that's what they call the entire feast. So the Feast of Passover is all about how God saved his people from the slavery in Egypt. How he raised up Moses and used him to bring in the 10 plagues on Egypt. And then for the 10th and the final plague, God killed the firstborn of the people and of the cattle in all the land of Egypt. But he gave Moses very specific instructions on what to do in order for the death angel to pass over their homes and to spare the firstborn of all of the Israelites. You see, the final event that takes place in the Passover ends up being what the entire celebration is called. And in the same way, the English and German-speaking peoples also ended up naming our entire celebration after the final and main event that takes place. And that is resurrection. That's what Easter means. It means resurrection. Our entire event of Easter, which we don't really celebrate the week-long event anymore like Christians in the past have. But our entire Easter celebration literally is just resurrection, which I think is very appropriate. But anyway, and then some will still have objections to this and say that the name Easter has its origins in the pagan goddess called Ishtar. And this claim finds its source from one quote. It's from the 8th century by a man named the Venerable Bede. In 725 A.D., Bede writes about why certain months have their names and he takes a quick pause to mention why Pascha is called Easter. And this is a quote from his book called The Reckoning of Time. So Eostre Manath, which is Easter month, has a name which is now translated Paschal month, and which was once called after the goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honor feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate that Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance. So I don't know if you caught that or not. But what Bede is saying here, all he's doing is he's mentioning that the Paschal season is only called Easter because it just so happens to be the month that it most often falls in is the month called Easter month. He isn't saying that the celebration itself is from Eostre. He's saying that there once was a goddess with that name, and that they named a month after her, and that the month that we now call April was named Easter month in her honor, and that Easter only got its name Easter because it just so happens to most often fall in the month called Easter to them. So let me ask you a question. Do we celebrate Julius Caesar when we celebrate the 4th of July? When we're celebrating Independence Day, are we worshiping Julius Caesar? No. Obviously not. The only reason why we call it the 4th of July is because it just so happens to fall within July. I mean, I'm sure many of you know that July gets its name in honor of Julius Caesar. But our celebrations that we have in July have nothing to do with the man at all, even if they bear his name. It's got nothing to do with them. It's just because it just so happens to fall within July. And this is no different when it comes to Easter. The only reason why it has that name, according to Bede, is because the holiday most often falls within the month that used to be called in English Easter month. And so at best, someone who makes the argument that Easter is really a celebration of and worship of Eostra because of the namesake either doesn't really understand the history of these things or has a really shallow view of history. Or at worst, that person is being disingenuous or is lying to you. And to make the case even stronger, and you have Roman soldiers, merchants, and slaves who were already making their way into northern Europe by the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And we have archaeological evidence of Christian presence in cities like, I'm probably going to butcher some of these names, but Tyre, Cologne, Mainz, maybe, but from that time period. So we have Christian presence in these cities from that time period. And recently, archaeologists found a silver amulet in a Roman cemetery near Frankfurt, dating to the year AD 230 to 270. And it contains an inscription that reads, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And that makes this the earliest material witness that we have of Christianity north of the Alps. And it was in 313 AD when the Christians in that area started having more of a public presence. In the late 4th century, the missionary with I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name, so I'm gonna try it. It says Wolfil, I don't know, but he translated the Bible into the Gothic language. Yeah, bringing the word to the German tribes even outside of the Roman borders. And finally, in the years AD 600 to 800, this is the time that began the great missionary era. So after the fall of Rome, the northern Europeans fell back into paganism. And during this time, we see the great acts of missionary work. And if you remember, back in December when I gave my Defense of Christmas lesson, we talked about this guy a little bit as an Anglo-Saxon monk by the name of Winfrid, whose name was changed to Saint Boniface. And he is famous for cutting down the Thor's oak in Hesse to prove the supremacy of Christ over the Norse gods. And then by AD 725, the Anglo-Saxons had been Christian for over a century at this point. So when Bede writes when Bede writes about the goddess Eostra, he is writing about a time-honored name of the old observance, or in other words, he is describing a past pagan tradition that is already long dead by his day. He's looking back into history. He's not describing what it is that his neighbors are doing. And the most striking thing about the goddess Eostra is that outside of Bede's writing, she does not exist. There are no altars to Eostra. There are no inscriptions, no poems, no myths, no prayers in her name or in any Germanic or Anglo-Saxon archaeological find. Not one. Aside from Bede's one-sentence mention in 725 AD, the goddess Eostra is completely invisible to history. So I'm not saying that Bede was necessarily incorrect. He was closer to the events than we are. But if Bede is right, then why do we not find anything about this goddess Eostra? Not one shred of evidence. Nothing. If this goddess was so important to the, at that time, Germanic peoples, so important to them that they ended up naming an entire month after her, then why can't we find anything about her? Not one thing. I think Bede was simply engaging in an etymological guesswork. If Eostra ever existed as a major deity, then there is no proof of her whatsoever. The likely story is that Bede simply got it wrong, and the entire argument is built on a ghost. So then what about the Easter bunny and the Easter eggs? Surely the Easter bunny and the Easter eggs, I don't know, surely they came from paganism, right? It is true that bunnies and eggs have been used as pagan symbols of fertility and rebirth amongst many pagan religions, many pagan systems. But to answer this question, we really need to think about two important things. First, if the bunny and the eggs came from paganism, where exactly did they come from? And second, when exactly did these traditions start? And so for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend too much time on the first question. But what I will say from the outset is that there isn't a shred of evidence to even come close to proving that the bunny and the eggs of the Easter celebration come from paganism. There is no historical trace of lineage between any pagan belief and practice, and the practice of us using bunnies and eggs. In fact, the first person to even claim that maybe these things have their roots in paganism, the first person is from the 19th century by a man named Jacob Grimm. And he was only hypothesizing that since Easter has its origins from Eostra, and which we now know is certainly not true, then the Easter bunny and the eggs may possibly have their origins of paganism as well, and probably from Eostra. But he didn't have any claim for this proof that he was making. The only thing that he was going off of was that quote that I mentioned earlier from Bede. So he wasn't really even sure himself. It was only conjecture. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to pick on the guy. Grimm was an historian, and he was a good historian. And he was a good writer too. I'm sure you've heard of the Grimm brothers. That's one of them. I mean, he was doing good historical hypothesizing, but that's all it was. It was an hypothesis. But the problem is, if there never was a goddess named Eostra in the first place, then the symbols of the Easter bunny and the eggs couldn't have possibly have come from her. So the other most common claim from modern skeptics often repeat the claim that the rabbit is the symbol of Ishtar. But there's only one problem with that. Archaeologists and Assyrianologists have found that Ishtar's symbols were the lion, the horse, and the 8-pointed star. Not the bunny. It has nothing to do with the bunny at all. This claim that Ishtar's symbol was a bunny and that she was the goddess of fertility, this claim comes from the 19th century. It comes from a 19th century invention with no ancient textual support. To reject a tradition based on an historical lie is not discernment. It's being misled. And to the second question about the timing of when the Easter bunny and the egg started, well, it makes our case even stronger. The first mention of the Easter bunny comes straight out of the 16th century in Germany. The Easter bunny is actually, in its origin, a Protestant tradition. It's not, and also in its origins, it wasn't actually a bunny; it was a hare. But the bunny doesn't come into the picture until we get to the New World. It only started. There's no kids in here, all right. It only started as a fun game that parents would play with their kids. The parents would tell their kids that if they were good, the Easter hare would come and they would bring presents and sweets, and that he would bring eggs. And we now know, we know this for certain because of a document from 1572. And it was written by by a man named Frankenau, who talks about this, and he talks about what I just told you. Well, in other words, he's talking about how the Easter hare started, and that he talks about how parents would get their kids all excited about Easter, and they would tell them that you need to be good during Lent. You need to be good for the time leading up to Easter if you want the Easter hare to bring you eggs and bring you presents and bring you sweets. And this is how it started. It started around the same time that the Santa Claus started, and for the same reasons, to try and get kids to obey, to try and give them a reason to be good. And if you're curious as to how, since their Easter hare is German in origin, how it's made its way to America, well, it came over here from the German and Swiss immigrants who came to America in the 1700s. They brought their traditions with them. And in case you're wondering, these immigrants were the Anabaptists and the Amish. So my ancestors. They moved to America because of persecution. And when they came over here, like I said, they brought their traditions with them. And it took a while for it to catch on here in the Americas. But when it did catch on, it had changed from the Easter hare to the Easter bunny. And most likely because bunnies are more common in the Americas than the hare is. If I'm not mistaken, I believe the hare is native to Europe and the bunny is native to North America. I might be wrong about that, but bunnies are most certainly more common than hares are. And so that's probably why the name changed. But in particular, though, it was the Pennsylvania Dutch that brought over the Easter bunnies. And what I find a little ironic is that, I don't know if you know or not, but the majority of the Pennsylvania Dutch people, what are they? Who are they? They're Amish. And the Amish now, they do not incorporate the Easter bunny or the Easter eggs into their Easter practices anymore, because they say it's pagan. But they did do it back then. And I find it funny because the very tradition that they brought over here themselves is the tradition that they no longer take part of. And it's all because of the lie that started in the 1800s. The lie that deemed it as pagan. And I actually find it pretty sad. So then what about the eggs? So we will be discussing Lent in this section as well, because Lent and eggs are very much tied together. And now, to be fair, we don't actually know for certain when the tradition of the Easter egg started. But the oldest tradition for the Christian usage of eggs is attributed at least to the Christians of Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq and Syria. So in the early church, around AD 100 to 300, the earliest tradition goes back to there. Now, these early believers are accredited with being the first to stain the eggs red in memory of the blood of Christ. And for these Eastern Christians, the egg was a teaching tool. So the hard, cold shell represented the sealed tomb, and the chick breaking through represents Christ rising from the dead. But as I said before, we don't actually know for sure when the Easter egg started. It's just the tradition that they have. So the first official written record of the Easter eggs appears as a practice that moved from the Eastern Church into Western Europe in the 12th century. But it must have started at some point before that, but also after they started doing Lent. Because as I mentioned, a common objection is that the 40-day Lent is actually some sort of 40 days of weeping for Tammuz. And my response to the Tammuz objection is found in the actual chronology of the early church and the textual mandate of the gospel. So as we have we have no need to look at Ezekiel's abominations to find the source of the Christians' 40-day fast. By the way, whenever they mention the 40 days of weeping for Tammuz, what they're referencing here is Ezekiel 8:14. But first of all, there is no record in ancient Mesopotamia of a 40-day fast for Tammuz. Yeah, the early church sought to prepare for Pesach, resurrection, by imitating the Lord's own preparation for his ministry. And furthermore, the number 40 is the most common probationary number in the Bible. So you have 40 days of rain and the flood, 40 years of wandering in the wilderness for Israel, 40 days of fasting for Moses. And then, of course, you have the 40 days of fasting in the wilderness before Jesus started his ministry. To claim the church chose 40 years because of Tammuz when the Bible is saturated with the number 40 as a period of testing is to ignore the clear internal evidence of Scripture. And the oldest mention that we have of Lent is from the 2nd century. You have Irenaeus of Lyons writes that some fast for 1 day, some fast for 2, and some fast for 40 hours before Easter. Then in the 4th century, after the Council of Nicaea, this is when the 40-day period started to become more common. But what does Lent and eggs have to do with each other? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. During Lent, you're not allowed to eat meat, and they considered eggs to be meat. And so during those 40 days, poor people would often gather their eggs, and they would preserve them for the 40 days. Because that was one of the only things that would actually last pretty well during that time, especially if they hard-boiled them. So they would boil the eggs, so that way they would last the entire 40 days. And and so for the poor people, after those 40 days, hard-boiled eggs seem to be quite the treat. You're not going to be killing any animals because the meat's not going to last that long. So what's the first thing that they're going to be able to get their hands on after the 40 days is over? It's going to be an egg. That's the most readable thing, at their disposal. And so, why not start decorating them? Why not decorate the thing that you're sitting there looking at for 40 days, salivating over? And you're just waiting. You're just waiting for the time to be right where you can finally dig back in and start eating them. And so they started decorating them. It only seems to be a natural progression for the Christians. It gave them something to do. It gave them something fun for their children to take part of. After they would decorate them, they would hide them. They'd hide them for their kids to go and find on Easter morning. In my opinion, this is a beautiful tradition. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. But then eventually, within the Protestant traditions at least, Lent, for some Protestant traditions, Lent was no longer observed. But the eggs did stick around. So for the last bit of time that we have left, I don't have time to go over objection 5. But we will go over objection 6. And this is that Jesus said that he would be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. And so Good Friday to Sunday morning isn't long enough. It doesn't work. All right, so objectors will often say that Good Friday crucifixion and Easter Sunday resurrection are mathematically impossible and scripturally fraudulent. They contend that Jesus was not in the grave for exactly 72 hours, or that if Jesus was not in the grave for 72 hours, then he failed the only sign that he gave to prove his messiahship. So their anchor for this objection is Matthew 12:40, where it says, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be there 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." So they will argue that a day is 12 hours, a night is 12 hours. So you have 3 days and 3 nights, 72 hours. That from Friday afternoon to Sunday morning is only 36 to 40 hours. So part of Friday, all of Saturday, and then a few hours into Sunday. And so therefore they conclude if Jesus arose on Sunday morning, that he must have been buried on Wednesday afternoon. Now to be fair to their position, there is a lot more they have to this argument, but we just simply don't have time to look at all of it. But I will say that they either fail to see or refuse to recognize the Hebrew idiom, a day and a night. So the Jerusalem Talmud explicitly states that a day and a night are an ona, or a portion of time, and a portion of an ona is as the whole of it. So in Second Temple Judaism thought, any part of the day is reckoned as the whole day. And to be clear, I don't actually hold any faith in the Talmud whatsoever. All I'm doing is I'm simply pointing out that this is how they reckon time at that time in Second Temple Judaism. So 3 days and 3 nights was the common Semitic idiom for 3 calendar days. So, Friday, day 1, Saturday, day 2, and Sunday, day 3 perfectly satisfies the legal and idiomatic requirements of the sign of Jonah. Furthermore, they failed to see Jesus' constant refrain, the third day, while 3 days and 3 nights appears in the Gospels, but only once. The third day appears over 20 times in the New Testament and to describe the resurrection. So I'm going to rattle some of them off for you really quickly. So Matthew 16:21, and be killed and raised on the third day. Matthew 17:23, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. Matthew 20:19, and on the third day he will be raised. Mark 9:31, and when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. Mark 10:34, and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise again. Luke 9:22, and be killed and be raised on the third day. Luke 13:32, and on the third day I reach my goal. Luke 18:33, and they will kill him, and on the third day he will rise again. John 2:19-21, destroy this sanctuary, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Or Matthew 27:63-65, when the Pharisees are remembering his words, after 3 days I am raising up again. And so they requested to put a guard out in front of the tomb until the third day. And then you have Luke 24:21, and this was written. This is when the risen Jesus is speaking to the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus on Sunday afternoon. All right, and this is those 2 disciples saying, "Besides all this, now it is the third day since these things have happened." Acts 10:40. This is Peter preaching to Cornelius, and he said, "God raised them up on the third day and granted that he becomes visible." And I could say a lot more, but I'm gonna move on.
Can I say one thing right quick?
Yeah.
2, their time was night and day. So
Right.
technically when he died, he was like Friday, but when he died, he was buried right before Sunday, technically Saturday, because that was night to day. So
Yep.
technically he died and he was buried. He died on Friday afternoon, but when he was buried, it was right before the Sabbath, because that started at sunset.
Right.
So technically the time frame still works out the same way, but we have to look at it a little different from where they're looking at it, too.
Right. It's because of that Hebrew idiomatic expression.
Yeah.
And I could go on. There are so many more passages like this, but I think my point has been made clear. If you take the Wednesday crucifixion, then Sunday morning would be the 5th day. And this would make every single verse listed above untrue. And if you take the Thursday crucifixion view, then that makes Sunday the fourth day. This would also make these verses untrue. But if you take the Friday crucifixion view, using the inclusive reckoning, right? Friday day 1, Saturday day 2, Sunday day 3, then you are allowing the scriptures to speak as they are written. Only a Friday crucifixion allows Sunday to be the third day. Jesus was not giving a lesson in chronometry, but he was giving a lesson in experience. Jonah was swallowed by death by the great fish and delivered back to the land of the living. Jesus was swallowed into the heart of the earth, the death and the tomb, and delivered on the third day. The sign was about the victory over death, not the number of minutes on the clock. To focus on the 72 hours is to miss the forest through the trees. But to sum this up, Easter has its start all the way back in the first generation of Christians. So not in paganism, and it never has been. You don't have to feel ashamed when people tell you that it's pagan. You don't have to be afraid of Easter and the Easter bunny and Easter eggs. You don't need to worry about if you are offending God because of you celebrating Easter. When they tell you that it's pagan, know with certainty that they have no idea what they're talking about. You don't have to worry about the Passover meal being changed to the Last Supper meal, because Jesus freed us from the law anyway. It's all for the glory of God. It's all to honor Jesus, the one that lived a perfect life, the one that fulfilled the entire law that we couldn't. So feel free to celebrate what Jesus did for us, because Jesus is the only one who actually deserves it. I don't put you on the spot, so if you don't want to, feel free to say no. But would you mind praying us out today?
I'll pray.
Okay.
Dear Father, we just thank you for allowing us to be in your house today to worship, and thank you for the lesson today. And ultimately, we just appreciate what Jesus did coming in on Palm Sunday, and he died and he rose again. We thank you that we worship a risen Savior. So we just thank you for all that you do for us, and help us as we go out. Bring us back in at a point in time that we just continue to honor you, glorify you, and worship you in everything that we do, and give you all the grace and praise. In your wonderful name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.